I wanted to know, what is the oldest webcomic you can still read? Seems like a simple question. Type it into Google and boom. T.H.E. Fox by Joe Ekaitis. Cool, that was easy. Now, let's read. This might require some effort. The history of webcomics is probably one of the worst preserved art histories. Trying to dig back and research leads you to a graveyard of broken links and dead websites. A lot of it is just lost media now, stories we may never recover. But some online comics had to have survived, right? Someone had to have archived them. Well...
You really want to know?
What?
Are you sure you want to know?
Furries. The answer is furries, apparently. That's why the oldest surviving online comics that you, watching this video, can still find and read, albeit with a bit of effort, are furry webcomics. Welcome to the study of history, where you don't get to choose what was preserved. Look, I'm not here to judge anyone's life choices, and God knows the furry fandom gets enough flack for existing, but let me clear something up right off the bat. T.H.E. Fox isn't that kind of furry webcomic. Even though those kinds of comics are basically responsible for the furry fandom existing in the first place. Some people say it's Disney's fault thanks to things like Robin Hood and the Lion King, but the underbelly of the print comics world is what really lit the fire. When the Comics Code Authority went into effect in 1954, mainstream publications like Marvel and DC rushed to adhere to the guidelines and censors. But American counterculture of the 60s and 70s looked at that and said,
"Go fuck yourself."
And this is how we got the underground comics movement. That's comics with an X because they often dealt with, X ratings. Things like Fritz the Cat, that super raunchy cat movie Saberspark did a video on, and Omaha the Cat Dancer by Reed Waller and Kate Worley, which straight up featured explicit. Omaha and her publisher would attract a fan base that is largely credited to have evolved into the furry fandom at science fiction and comic conventions. But it wasn't really like a thing until the 1980s, when they started holding conventions themselves. And whatever your opinion on furries is, after reading just how far creator Joe Ekaitis took his characters, it was hard to not be impressed by his determination. Even if 99% of people nowadays have never heard of them. He even went head-to-head against the great cease-and-desist behemoth Disney at one point. When I started my own journey for answers on this topic, I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole would take me. At first, I wasn't having luck finding any comics at all, just this title banner. I dredged some of the most obscure blogs and wikis to unearth every dead link I could find. I fired up the Internet Archive, and eventually I came across a treasure trove. A massive archive of T.H.E. Fox comics. But even that was so old that I still had trouble getting the files on my computer. And there's still some comics missing from that collection. But that's the reality of digital comics and characters. Except, Ekaitis didn't go down quite so easily. Back when he started this comic, he had a goal: syndication. Get these silly foxes and rabbits so popular that they could escape their digital prison into a physical release. More specifically, newspaper syndication. He wanted his comics to be running right alongside the likes of Charlie Brown, Garfield, and Ziggy. It wasn't an easy road for him, especially operating on the early internet and technology that quickly became outdated. So, let's rewind to the beginning. But first, thanks for joining me on this adventure. I'm Zombie Comics, and I hugely appreciate it if you like and subscribe to let YouTube know that there's a place for webcomic history and analysis on the internet. And if there's any obscure corners of online comic history you want me to look into, leave a comment. Now let's make like Hollywood and go back to the mid-1980s. The internet is far older than what most people think, and online comics are just as old. Back in the early days of the internet, people posted comics wherever they could, mostly on sites that aren't around anymore. It wasn't until the advent of sites like Webtoon, Comixology, Tapas, and Netcomics that webcomics became more centralized. Keenspot is another site that especially helped revolutionize the online comics community, and was founded by Chris Crosby, another early webcomic artist. Though, not as early as Ekaitis. So while it's kind of impossible to say what the actual oldest webcomic is, all we can say is what was among the earliest. We know of Witches and Stitches from 1985, a parody of The Wizard of Oz, but that's a series completely lost. 1 year later, in 1986, T.H.E. Fox debuted. And while several of the earliest episodes have slipped through the cracks, you can still read a huge catalog of the webcomic from its 12-year run, albeit with some digging. Every piece of art has an artist, and T.H.E. Fox is no exception. But there was just one problem. This artist wasn't really an artist. Our story starts a bit before the first episode of T.H.E. Fox was ever posted. It starts with American electronics manufacturer Commodore in 1980, when they announced the 8-bit home computer VIC-20, predecessor to the much more well-known Commodore 64. Back then it ran for around $300 US. You might be thinking, that's not that much for a computer, but adjusted for inflation, that's more like $1,000. A bit out of people's price range. People like Joe Ekaitis, who definitely had to wait for them to go on sale. He said that he was always interested in machines and stuff like that, so when they became affordable, he plopped down $240 for a VIC-20 at a Toys R Us. He would eventually write a program to draw a raccoon's face, and his fate was sealed. He was on the fast track to making some of the earliest internet cartoons, though he seems like the least likely candidate for an art history video like this. He never took formal art lessons, and he scored the lowest marks in even his grade school classes. In fact, it wasn't until he was 18 that he even tried to draw. But the more he worked at drawing, the better he seemed to get. And that's how art is. There really are no shortcuts. It wasn't until 1986 that he formally hunkered down and poured what little he had into T.H.E. Fox. By then, he had upgraded to a Commodore 64. According to him, it was used for just 3 things: drawing T.H.E. Fox, uploading it, and playing games, namely Pinball and Defender. The initial strips consisted of one pixel art panel, a teeny tiny resolution of 160 by 200, and only 16 colors. Sometimes they'd be slightly bigger at 320 by 200 pixels, but with half the amount of colors. And these took him between 2 hours to half a day to complete. And this was cutting-edge technology. And when he wasn't fighting aliens in Defender, he was grinding away on his Commodore 64 Koala Pad on his Koala Painter program to toss these weekly comics out on CompuServe and Quantum Link. Yes, weekly. We already had regular uploaders back in the 80s. See, even though Ekaitis didn't really see himself as an artist, he had some big plans for his little comic. Like I said before, he wanted to make the jump from digital to physical, whether that meant running T.H.E. Fox in magazines, newspapers, or whatever. And this is a pretty common desire from artists, even today. The emotions of posting your creation versus physically holding it in your hands, it's not even comparable. As for the characters themselves, there's a long-standing trope about foxes being these tricksters. Always mischievous, always scheming. You can see this imagery in folklore from around the world, or even cartoons and movies like the DreamWorks film The Bad Guys. It was something that didn't miss the attention of Ekaitis. But the event that Ekaitis cites as the inspiration for the Fox character was very specifically the 1972 Dick Cavett Thanksgiving show with guest stars Jim Henson and the Muppets. The idea of using a friendly fox as a cartoon character was always on my mind. I always wondered why other animals were considered cute, like bears and raccoons, when bears and raccoons eat just as many rabbits as foxes do. If bears and raccoons and skunks, then why not foxes? Shake off the stereotypes, so to speak. The idea of a neutral fox is the entire basis of the character. Ekaitis says his fox is like an island of comparable sanity in a swirl of madness. In other words, he's meant to play the straight man in most situations. And naturally, the straight man plays opposite of a more wild card character.
Wild card, bitches! Yeah! What?
In this case, being his friend and roommate, Bun. I paired him up with a rabbit for a little comic tension. When you see the two side by side with one not trying to harm the other, there's just a little uneasiness that never goes away. I called the character T.H.E. Fox because it looked classy when written. When someone pressed me to spell out his name, I blurted out Thaddeus Horatio Eberhard. Yeah, that's what the T.H.E stands for. Bit of a mouthful. Bun's name was a contraction of Bunny, of course. I used 2 N's because Walt Kelly already had a character in Pogo named Bun Rabbit. I said that his full name was Bunnington Ellsworth Rabbit, or Bun E. Rabbit. Bun evolved into a wilder character. I don't know how it happened, but it did. Bun is more likely to push a button that says "do not push" than Thad is. Other characters include Grizzly MD, obviously a bear, Wilt the Wolf, for similar reasons as Thaddeus breaking the sly fox trope, an unnamed coyote who convinces Thaddeus that the Spanish word for fox is El Zorro, Thaddeus' nephew Ferdinand, and his and Bun's girlfriends Vicky and Roxy. The cast of characters weren't here because Ekaitis was doing a ton of world building. They were mostly created for a gag to work. T.H.E. Fox was basically your typical shenanigans in real life, a la something like Seinfeld.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
He drew from his own favorite cartoons like Calvin and Hobbes and Outland, and favorite cartoonists like Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, and Tex Avery. Though nowadays, well, you'd be lucky to get an exhale out of these comics. Many are extremely dated, or just aren't that funny to begin with. But I've yet to meet anyone who rolls on the floor laughing at something like Garfield, and, well, he's still getting movies.
I apologize in advance. The eating you're about to see will not be pretty.
Obviously, there's an audience for these kinds of series, and Ekaitis built up a fan base that quickly became worldwide. Not to mention that the organized furry fandom was forming around this time. These characters came out at the perfect moment. A science fiction convention in 1980 held a discussion about Steve Gallacci's Albedo Anthropomorphics, a comic about a futuristic society of anthropomorphic animals, which would eventually make its way into webcomics around 2016. This discussion group would begin meeting regularly throughout the 80s, leading to the first furry-focused convention, Conference Zero, in 1989. While Ekaitis wouldn't take part in these first few gatherings, he would eventually contribute to the Conference 9 con book, as well as the one for Anthrocon 2000 and Anthrocon 2002. From posting on CompuServe and Quantum Link, he would eventually move Thaddeus Fox and Bun to a site called Genie. No, not that Genie. Though not unrelated to this next part of the story. Long before Zootopia was pairing a fox and rabbit up, Ekaitis beat them to the punch by 30 years. And the theme of their natural tension was a driving force in both stories. It's definitely just a coincidence, but Disney would become aware of T.H.E. Fox and Ekaitis when his comics hit this new website. So the site Genie, short for General Electric Network for Information Exchange, wasn't even around for a full 15 years, but it boasted some impressive features for the time, including fully playable 3D games like Cyberstrike. They also had sub-communities called Roundtables, which had chat rooms, forums, and a whole library for files, and some very notable names used this site back in the day. Tom Clancy, Neil Gaiman, Will Wheaton, and loads more were all users, often floating around the science fiction roundtable. The roundtables that Ekaitis posted to was the Disney Roundtable, Commodore Roundtable, and naturally the Comix Roundtable. The Comix area was perfectly welcoming to him, hosting episodes of T.H.E. Fox as permanent files. The Disney Roundtable was just as receptive. Until it wasn't. Disney has a long history of anthropomorphic animals. In fact, at this point, it would almost be weird to see a Disney movie without one. So it stands to reason that fans of Disney might be fans of the animal characters from Ekaitis. And for a time, they were. They loved these comics. Ekaitis said that the Disney Roundtable included his comics in their permanent library. But it turned out to not be so permanent once the actual company caught wind of his comics. Ekaitis never explained why exactly his work was purged, only joking that Disney CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, was such a party pooper. It generally seems like companies and rights holders were a lot stricter when it came to the early internet. Then again, Ekaitis wasn't affiliated with Disney in any way, so maybe the mods decided to retroactively scrub his comics to avoid confusion. It's hard to say. Luckily for readers, though, there was always the Comix Roundtable, and this setback from the mouse gods didn't actually hinder him all too much. He was still chasing that dream of getting his characters in a more solid format. And there were a few opportunities just around the corner. While the early strips were made in a pixel art style, later strips were inked, scanned onto a PC, and touched up with paintbrush. He gradually drifted further and further away from the digital-only drawing style. Internet artists are spoiled nowadays. Drawing with a tablet gives you so much freedom and control over every line and color. These things were much more restricted back in the 80s, at least without some special equipment.
As long as you have enough rubies.
So these characters jumped from digital only to scan drawings, but they jumped to an even bigger platform when they landed on television. No, seriously. You probably haven't heard of the public access television show Rapid T. Rabbit and Friends, but you know some of their guest stars. Bugs Bunny, Paddington, several Muppets from Sesame Street, and even one Charles Entertainment Cheese. Yes, the Nightmare Pizza Rat that spawned the unkillable Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. And this TV show apparently ran until 2017. I'm shocked Freddy Fazbear himself never guest starred on the show, since the pattern and nature of these guest stars were other furry or anthropomorphic characters that were relevant around the time of a specific episode. Besides, Thaddeus and Foxy basically look the same, right? And it's not like the show wouldn't lend itself to some great analog horror nowadays. It was a puppet show with skits and parodies, feeling very improvised and chaotic at times. I wouldn't say there were hordes and hordes of people clamoring for it, but an opportunity is an opportunity, and Ekaitis and Thaddeus would be featured on the show on more than one occasion. On July 23, 1990, Ekaitis would make an entirely new segment for episode 212, complete with music and even a voice for Thaddeus.
Might be of interest.
Here now is T.H.E. Fox, the world's first weekly electronic comic strip by Joe Ekaitis.
Yay!
Sorry everyone, the opening credits used up all of this week's panels.
Okay, maybe I made it sound a little more impressive than it actually was. A live-action version of Thaddeus would even appear. However, there are several episodes of this program that have been completely lost, and one of the only clips I could find of this live-action Thaddeus was a skit called T.H.E. Fox Prisoner, a parody of the opening to the 1968 TV series The Prisoner. This would lead to further collaborations between the show and Ekaitis, like parade appearances, which led to even more recognition. From just webcomics to television and parades, Ekaitis was unstoppable. Syndication had to be right around the corner. It had to be. He would keep gaining ground little by little. The comic was getting shoutouts in computer magazines like .info and Run. Thaddeus and Bun would feature in editorial cartoons for the San Bernardino Sun about oh my god, the O.J. Simpson murder case? And the price of groceries. As the comic ran out of the 80s and into the 90s, Ekaitis kept at it with the hope of syndication, and things moving very tentatively in that direction. The 90s also marked a shift in the webcomics world. More and more people were coming online, meaning that more and more people could post comics. Where the Buffalo Roam would start in 1991, with Dr. Fun following 2 years later in 1993. Then suddenly, in 1994, we had Netboy, The Afterlife of Bob, Virtually Reality. The internet was sitting on a powder keg. The webcomics community was about to explode. They were moving out of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age. The mid-90s is when the amount of webcomics was quickly firing into the hundreds, and plenty of artists jumped on this train, including the Keenspot founder I mentioned earlier, Chris Crosby. Crosby's character, Snap the Punk Turtle, would catch the attention of AnotherUniverse.com, who would commission Snap as a regular series. Meanwhile, more and more magazines picked up T.H.E. Fox, with Ekaitis mentioning that Thaddeus and Bun made the cover of TC 128 magazine, and Carousel Trader printed the Carousel Gag strip. The Szechuan Gag appeared in a fan magazine dedicated to the Pern series. Wait, Szechuan Gag? Oh god.
I'll go out and I'll find some more of that Mulan Szechuan teriyaki dipping sauce, Morty.
These were good, massive strives for a little webcomic like this, but it wasn't quite his end goal. T.H.E. Fox wasn't getting picked up for regular distribution. Not to mention, while hundreds of comic artists were revving their engines up in 1994, Ekaitis was slowing down his production of T.H.E. Fox. Frankly, I think T.H.E. Fox is better than some of the stuff on the funny pages. And equally frankly, there's a lot of stuff funnier than T.H.E. Fox. You have to catch the submissions editor on the right day in the right mood. It's a long shot, but the experience is overall exhilarating. However, right after saying this in an interview with the Commodore Roundtable, he revealed some new info. Prior to this comic, Ekaitis teased his fans about some very exciting news. T.H.E. Fox had found a publisher, an indie comic book from Chris Crosby and their brother Bobby, called Super Crew Comics, an imprint of SCC Entertainment. Yeah, Chris Crosby wasn't just working on Snap the Punk Turtle. Crosby had big plans for a character called Scorn, a badass sci-fi gun-toting 90s girl. And with Scorn getting her own comic, the Crosby siblings would need backup stories. And according to online comic archives, but only a couple, Joe Ekaitis was one of the creators for those backup stories. But I'm not one to take info at face value. Like, 2 sites listed Ekaitis as a contributor. And none of the credits on the Scorn covers listed him either. So I figured, what better way to verify than to just read these series myself? But, Scorn is painfully obscure. If you search Scorn comics, you get Marvel's symbiote character. I couldn't even find comic scans of dubious legality. So I just bought them myself. Straight to the source, you know? Scorn was like what you get if you combine the Green Lantern, Captain Marvel, and Ellen Ripley, along with, like, the villains from She-Ra. As the story goes, 5 years ago, Scorn's home planet was invaded by the Rulemakers and their villainous leader, Figurehead, who quickly took over. Scorn was still a young girl named Kaylee at the time, but her father was part of the rebellion. After he was seemingly killed by the Rulemakers, Kaylee would go on to eventually lead the rebellion. Quite successfully, too. At least until she was captured, taken hostage, and placed in a virtual reality, along with her best friend T.H.E, who went from looking like a reject Dragon Ball Z side character in issue 1 to a grizzled war vet in issue 2. Through sheer force of will and some vaguely defined superpowers, Scorn managed to break out of the false world. And with the help of a mysterious soldier called Hope, Scorn and T.H.E escaped the Rulemaker's ship to further adventures across bizarre planets and run-ins with deadly foes. The Scorn stories ran between 17 and 36 pages, but each comic had 48 pages to fill. That's where the Crosby siblings started bringing in other creators. Milton Tarul would write the Iron Panther in Scorn Deadly Rebellion, Rob Potchak Jr. would co-write Artie, the City That Never Sleeps in Heatwave and Naked Truth with Chris Crosby, but Ekaitis was the only artist to contribute a backup story to every single issue of Scorn. Ekaitis ran into the SCC Entertainment people on the Prodigy online service. Sure, this wasn't your Marvel, DC Comics, Dark Horse, or Image publishers, but plenty of massive franchises started with humble beginnings, like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Ekaitis noted. And SCC already had some massive names collaborate, including Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, and Stan Lee himself in the Super Crew Comic Convention special from 1994. 12 panels of T.H.E. Fox would be featured in a special edition of the comic called the SCC Super Spiffy Springtime Special and would be available at comic book dealers for $2.25. And I would love to show you here, except that I can't find any evidence of its existence outside of this mention in the Commodore Roundtable interview. So, while it's possible that that fell through, Ekaitis would go on to write backup strips of T.H.E. Fox in all of the Scorn comics, starting with Scorn Deadly Rebellion in 1996. By this point, though, the title of T.H.E. Fox had been changed to just Thaddeus, and Ekaitis was all geared up to continue these into Scorn Fractured and Scorn Hostage. After all, the Scorn series was moderately successful, enough for Chris Crosby to announce the titles of the entire planned pentology. There were even plans for a spin-off comic following the character Eliza Landis. But only 3 Scorn comics would release between 1996 and 1997. No spin-offs, nothing more from the titular character herself, which also meant no more backup stories. No more Thaddeus. Though it's worse for the ones with continuing plots. Scorn, Artie, they're just left forever unfinished. canceled like your favorite Netflix show. I will never forgive you for canceling Inside Job. SCC Entertainment was pretty short-lived. The only 3 series to their name is Scorn, Snap the Punk Turtle, and Anubis, a series about the tales of a character called Anubis Peldafar defending the inhabitants of Walden Town. This series was luckier than Scorn and Snap. After SCC Entertainment went under, Anubis was able to continue under Didactic Chocolate Press, another comic book publisher that went under even quicker than SCC. Then it was passed off to yet another publisher, Adventure Comics. That's 3 publishers in 3 years. Here we are in 1997, and if you've been paying attention to dates, that means we're reaching the twilight years of Thaddeus. The webcomic formally ran between 1986 and 1998. After more than a decade of 1 step forward and 2 steps back, Ekaitis was moving on to other content, other art, other writings. He would release a novel in 2006, Colin's Fort Village, a story about a boy who's friends with a driving bear and a massive griffin. This would be followed by 2 other writings in 2010, Revenge of the Gingerbread Man and Gulliver Mouse, with the former being about a giant gingerbread man monster. The Shrek 2 footage I'm showing is kind of irrelevant. Ekaitis' story actually predated the sequel. He never achieved his goal of newspaper syndication for Thaddeus. But before you click off the video, the story's not done just yet. Because whether you read Sarah Scribble's Cyanide Happiness or any of the artists over on R Comics, T.H.E. Fox was there when it all began. Ekaitis was on the front lines, back when big media companies were coming down much harder on indie comic artists navigating the new internet. He was getting his webcomic on television. Public access television, but if webcomics were only just starting to be taken seriously in the mid-2010s, it's remarkable he even got that far. Sure, his beloved furry friends never ran alongside Snoopy, Garfield, Hagar the Horrible, or any of those characters. But he was able to rub elbows with some big names in comics along the way. Chris Crosby would found Keenspot in 2000, becoming a haven to loads of webcomics and giving them a chance at physical releases. Even movies. The award-winning film Marry Me, starring Jennifer Lopez and Owen Wilson, was an adaptation of the webcomic of the same name, created by Bobby Crosby on Keenspot. And it's not alone. Plenty of titles from Keenspot have gotten movies, animated series, you name it. Chris would even revisit Scorn, rebooting the series in 2023. In this new version, the rule makers were instead just one man, the rule maker, who just so happened to be Scorn's father this time around, making her Princess Kaylee, as if the She-Ra parallels weren't strong enough. Elements from the original comics were retooled for a modern age. New characters like Scorn's maybe girlfriend Min and her villainous uncle Henoch have joined the cast, and it seems like a promising start. Or restart. And it's not like the Fox and Rabbit would go away forever once Ekaitis stopped creating new episodes of the comic in 1998. Thaddeus and Bun, or characters inspired by them, still pop up on his personal accounts every now and then, and word around the internet says Ekaitis is enjoying his time nowadays as the lead male soloist for the St. Mary's Catholic Church Choir in Fontana, California. The comic's place in webcomic history is a unique one. It's the oldest we can go back to. It's not the most thrilling or hilarious read, furry webcomics aren't everyone's cup of tea, and the art style can leave something to be desired for. But for being one of the first webcomics ever, Ekaitis took them as far as he could. And it was pretty far, all things considered. He never considered himself an artist. But him and his comic are an important part of webcomic history. All those years ago, Thaddeus walked so web series like Nimona could run. Now, if you'll excuse me, thanks to research for this video, I have a lot of furry related searches that I now need to clear from my browser history.